On a quiet evening at Windsor Castle, something unthinkable happened. A portrait, kept hidden for 25 years, locked away from public view, removed from the only place it belonged, was finally carried into the light. Not by accident, not by chance, but by a carefully orchestrated plan that took years to construct, involving a prince with a long memory, a princess with an older wound, and a woman who thought she had won everything. This is the story of what may have happened when a royal family finally decided to settle a debt that had haunted them for 2.5 decades. A story of quiet revenge, institutional power, and the price of underestimating a son who lost his mother too soon. If you have ever wondered how the royal family truly operates behind closed doors, subscribe now so you never miss the stories that shape thrones and topple the powerful. To understand what happened that night, we must first understand what was taken. Princess Diana died on August 31st, 1997, in a car crash in Paris. She was 36 years old. Within days, her death became the most mourned moment in modern British history. Millions wept. The streets filled with flowers. Her sons, William, just 15, and Harry, 12, walked behind her coffin, while a nation watched in devastation. But what happened in the weeks after her funeral told a very different story about grief inside the palace walls. Within months, the erasure began. Diana's apartments at Kensington Palace were sealed. Her personal effects were packed away. Her favorite bedroom, the one she would retreated to when the marriage was collapsing, was locked, untouched, as if her presence could somehow still disturb the air if anyone dared to open the door. Her name was removed from official histories. Her patronages quietly redistributed. The people who had worked closest to her, her staff, her advisors, those who knew her inner world, were quietly moved aside. And then there was the portrait. Stunning formal painting of Diana in her royal dress, captured at the height of her power and beauty, hung in the palatial corridors where the most significant royal women were honored. The Hall of Matriarchs was a sacred space, a gallery reserved for the mothers and queens who had shaped the monarchy. Elizabeth II's portrait hung there. Queen Mary's. The women who mattered. The women who had left a mark. Diana deserved to be there. Everyone knew it. But one person had other ideas. Camilla Parker Bowles, the woman at the center of Diana's marriage collapse. The woman Diana had called the third person, in her most raw, vulnerable moment, had influence now. She was becoming more powerful within palace circles, and one of her first acts was decisive and deliberate. Diana's portrait was removed. It did not happen with announcement or ceremony. There was no press release explaining why the Princess of Wales, the most beloved royal figure of her generation, was being systematically erased from the spaces she should have occupied forever. It simply vanished. The walls were repainted. The space was left bare, as if to say, "You were never really here." Even more crushing, the flowers that mourners had left in Diana's memory in the weeks after her death were removed by palace staff. Some say Camilla herself ensured they were taken away, a gesture so deliberate, so pointed, that it seemed to send a message to the grieving family. Stop honoring her. Stop remembering. Let her go. But William never let her go. William watched all of this happen. As a teenager, freshly traumatized by his mother's death, he watched as the woman his mother had warned him about orchestrated her complete removal from the only home she would known. He watched the portrait disappear. He watched her rooms sealed. He watched as Camilla gradually moved into positions of influence, consolidating power, making decisions that affected the monarchy's future. And he did not forget. For 25 years, Diana's portrait remained hidden, stored away in some back room or vault, seen only by staff members sworn to secrecy. The Hall of Matriarchs remained incomplete, a glaring absence that no one was permitted to acknowledge. And Camilla moved through the palace, believing she had won, believing she had successfully rewritten history. But she had made a critical mistake. She had underestimated a boy who was determined to become a man powerful enough to undo what she had done. But William's was not the only debt being held inside the palace. To understand what truly happened that evening at Windsor Castle, we must trace back even further to the 1970s, to a love triangle that predated even Charles and Diana, to Princess Anne and a man named Andrew Parker Bowles. Anne had loved him once. Deeply. By all accounts, Parker Bowles had been the great romance of her early adult life. But Camilla Shand, young and ambitious, had pursued him with a calculated intensity. She was beautiful. She was connected. She was willing to do whatever it took to secure a future within royal circles. And she won. Parker Bowles married Camilla, not Anne. Anne watched the man she loved marry her rival, and she moved forward with her life. She married Mark Phillips. She had children. She became a senior member of the royal family, revered for her dedication and her work ethic. But the wound never truly closed. For decades, Anne watched as Camilla used that victory to climb higher and higher. She watched as Camilla inserted herself into relationships, orchestrated positions of influence, and slowly became one of the most powerful women in palace life, not through merit, but through calculation and strategic relationships. When Diana's portrait was removed, Anne saw something more than just an act of cruelty against a dead woman. She saw a pattern. She saw a woman who had spent her entire adult life consolidating power through erasure and exclusion. And she saw an opportunity. She and William never explicitly spoke about it. There were no meetings where they formed a formal alliance, no written agreements. But what happened next unfolded as if they had been working toward it together all along. William began to study the institutional machinery of the palace. He learned how portraits were moved. He understood the protocols that governed which rooms housed which artwork. He met with curators and conservators. He built relationships with the people who actually controlled access and placement within the palace walls. He was building the machinery to undo what Camilla had done. And Anne watched, waited, prepared to act when the moment came. Neither of them rushed. They both understood that whoever moved first, loudly and publicly, would lose. Camilla would dig in. Charles might be forced to take her side. The portrait would be removed again, and the palace would close ranks around them both. No, this had to be surgical. Quiet, impossible to reverse once it happened. This had to be the kind of power move that could only be executed by people who had spent years quietly building the authority to carry it out. The years that followed Diana's death saw the royal family splinter in ways no one could have predicted. The wound she left behind did not heal. It calcified. It became the invisible structure around which everything else was built. Every dinner, every official engagement, every carefully worded statement became defined by what was not being said about her. William and Harry experienced this fractured world very differently. Harry chose confrontation, public, relentless, and unforgiving confrontation. He wrote about his grief in documentaries. He spoke about his mother's death in interviews that made headlines. He challenged the palace narratives directly, refusing to accept the institutional erasure that had happened after Diana died. He went to therapy publicly. He named Camilla. He spoke about his father's relationships. He would not be silenced, and he would not let the palace pretend that everything was normal. For years, Harry's approach seemed like the only honest way to process what had happened. The world watched him fight. The media covered every word. He gained supporters who believed that the palace needed to be held accountable for how they would treated Diana, how they would treated him, how they would allowed Camilla to consolidate power. But Harry's explosiveness came with a cost. The palace closed ranks against him. Charles grew more distant. The institution dug in. Camilla moved closer to the center of power, not further away. Every public confrontation seemed to strengthen her position, as if Harry's outbursts gave the palace an excuse to dismiss all criticism as the ravings of an unstable, bitter son who could not move on. Meanwhile, William chose a different path entirely. William was quiet. William was patient. William was methodical in a way that made people sometimes underestimate him. While Harry was on television talking about his trauma, William was something far more dangerous. He was learning how power actually worked. He attended every official function he was required to attend. He was present, respectful, dutiful. He joined charitable boards. He studied the structures of the monarchy, not by reading about them, but by being embedded inside them. He learned the names of the people who actually ran things. The conservators, the curators, the staff members who had been at the palace for decades, who understood its rhythms, who had seen queens come and go. And he listened. People confided in William in ways they did not confide in others. He was sympathetic. He was intelligent. He asked the right questions. He seemed to genuinely care about the things that mattered: duty, service, the long-term strength of the institution. Over years, he developed relationships with the people who held the actual keys to palace decision-making. One of these people was the curator of the royal art collection. William did not approach this person suddenly or suspiciously. There was no dramatic meeting. Instead, over the course of years, William began to take an interest in Windsor Castle's history. He started asking about the portraits that hung in the formal rooms. He inquired about the Hall of Matriarchs, specifically what it represented, why certain women were honored with placement there, how decisions were made about which portraits were displayed, and which were kept in storage. The conversations were natural. A young prince interested in preserving the palace's heritage. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would raise alarm. But William was gathering information. He was learning the protocols. He was discovering that portrait placement was not arbitrary. It followed specific guidelines about rank, historical significance, and institutional value. And he was beginning to understand that if those protocols were followed correctly, a portrait could be moved into the Hall of Matriarchs in a way that would be extremely difficult, perhaps impossible, to reverse. By all accounts, no one suspected what he was building toward. Charles certainly did not know. Camilla absolutely did not know. Even Anne, while she had her own reasons for waiting and watching, did not know the full scope of what William was constructing. He was operating completely alone, moving through the institution like water, leaving no trace of his true intentions. William also studied his father's weaknesses. He understood that Charles was ultimately motivated by wanting peace within the family. Charles wanted his sons to reconcile. Charles wanted the media scrutiny to end. Charles wanted to move forward. This meant that if the portrait restoration happened in a way that seemed inevitable, if it appeared to be the right decision made through proper institutional channels, rather than William forcing his father's hand, Charles might not fight it. Charles might, in fact, accept it as the best path forward. This was the key insight that would determine everything. Years passed. William completed his military service. He got married. He had children. He became the father of a young prince himself. He was still quiet, still dutiful, still learning, still meeting with curators, still asking questions about protocol, still building relationships with the people who actually controlled access to the palace's treasures. Meanwhile, Camilla continued to consolidate her position. She became the queen consort. She attended state functions. She held patronages. She had done what she set out to do. She had survived. She had won. She had become one of the most powerful women in the royal family. The portrait erasure had worked. No one talked about Diana anymore. Not really. Not in ways that threatened Camilla's position. She had, in her own mind, completely won. But she had been watching the wrong brother. Harry's public rage had been so loud, so constant, that it had consumed all the attention. The palace was braced for Harry's next revelation, his next documentary, his next interview. The institution was defending itself against Harry's explosions. No one was paying attention to William. No one noticed that he had spent the last 15 years quietly positioning himself inside the machinery of power. No one realized that a prince raised to believe in duty had transformed that belief into something far more strategic, a patient, methodical campaign to correct a historical wrong in a way that could not be stopped once it was underway. And by 2024, William had finally built enough power. He had the curators on his side. He had the protocols mapped out. He had relationships with the staff. He had ensured that the people who actually moved paintings, who actually made day-to-day decisions about the palace's interior, understood that this was the right thing to do. He had also, crucially, ensured that his father would accept it. All that remained was one thing: the execution. All that remained was the night when everything changed. The night was deliberately chosen. A state function in London. An evening engagement that Camilla could not refuse. An obligation that would keep her away from Windsor Castle for hours. The palace calendar had been studied carefully. This was a window that would not open again for months. This was the moment. William did not attend the event himself. He never would have. That would have drawn suspicion. Instead, he remained at Kensington Palace, waiting, knowing. The machinery he would built over 15 years was in motion now, and there was no way to stop it. At Windsor Castle, the Hall of Matriarchs was closed to visitors that evening. Official maintenance, the staff had been told. Nothing unusual, just routine work on the East Wing that required temporary closure. But the people moving through those corridors that night knew the truth. Princess Anne arrived in the late hours, when the castle had settled into darkness. She came alone, deliberately separated from her immediate security team, moving through the halls like someone who had owned these corridors her entire life. Because she had. Because this was her home, her institution, her family's legacy. She walked to the storage vault, where Diana's portrait had remained for 25 years. It was still beautiful, still stunning, still radiating the dignity and presence that had made Diana a global icon. The painting had been preserved meticulously, kept safe from the light and the damage of time, waiting for this moment like a prisoner waiting for release. Anne stood before it in silence. She thought about Andrew Parker Bowles. She thought about the 1970s and the woman who had stolen him away. She thought about 3 decades of watching Camilla build her power, brick by brick, manipulation by manipulation, erasure by erasure. She thought about Diana, a woman she had not known as well as the world had, but a woman she had respected, a woman who had been systematically removed from the place she deserved to occupy. Then Anne did what only she could do. She picked up the portrait. With her own hands, with the care of someone handling something sacred, she lifted it. The conservators who had been waiting stepped forward silently, prepared to move it now, to carry it to the Hall of Matriarchs. But Anne held it herself first, carrying it with a physical weight that was as much symbolic as it was real. This was the act of a senior royal woman correcting a historical injustice. This was institutional power being exercised not through memos or official channels, but through the sheer force of rightful authority. There was no way to claim this was a bureaucratic decision. There was no way to pretend this was a junior staff member acting independently. Anne was choosing this. Anne was claiming responsibility for this. The portrait was unwrapped carefully, the protective coverings removed, the gilded frame revealed, exactly as it had been on the day Diana had sat for the painting decades before. And then it was hung in the Hall of Matriarchs, beside Elizabeth II, beside the other women who had mattered, who had shaped dynasties, who belonged in this sacred space. The portrait of Diana in her royal dress, captured at the height of her power and beauty, was finally home. Anne stepped back and looked at it. The painting seemed to glow against the wall, as if it had been waiting for this moment as patiently as the people who loved Diana had been waiting. As if the portrait itself had been holding its breath for 25 years, waiting to return to the place where it belonged. It was done. By the time word reached Camilla that evening, she was still in London at the state function. The news came through palace staff, discreet, factual, impossible to deny. Your portrait removal has been reversed. The Princess of Wales's portrait has been restored to the Hall of Matriarchs. By order of Princess Anne, Camilla did not finish her obligations that evening. She left the event early, citing illness. She drove back to Windsor Castle in a fury that staff members would later describe in hushed tones, a woman possessed by rage so complete, so consuming, that she could barely contain it. She had been outmaneuvered. She had been publicly humiliated. She had been reminded, in the most dramatic way possible, that there were people in this institution more powerful than she was. When she arrived at Windsor, she went directly to the Hall of Matriarchs. Diana's portrait was still there, gleaming under the soft lights of the gallery. Undeniably, permanently there. The portrait had been moved by Princess Anne herself, the most senior royal woman in the family, a figure of such institutional authority that few would dare to challenge her directly. This was not a junior decision. This was not something that could be quietly reversed by tomorrow morning. Camilla demanded that it be taken down. She went to the palace staff. The portrait must be moved immediately, she insisted. This was inappropriate. This was disrespectful to her. This had been done without proper consultation. This needed to be fixed. The staff looked at her with expressions that were carefully neutral, professionally blank. But underneath that blankness was something very clear. No. "We will not do this." The order came from Princess Anne. "We do not override Princess Anne." Then she went to Charles. She demanded a meeting with the king. She needed him to understand what had happened. She needed him to reverse this decision. She needed him to stand beside her against the humiliation that Anne and William had orchestrated. Charles listened to her, and then, crucially, he did nothing. He did not order the portrait removed. He did not call Anne and demand an explanation. He did not side with Camilla against his sister. Instead, his silence was deafening. His inaction was a choice. For the first time in decades, perhaps for the first time in their entire relationship, Charles was choosing William over her. Charles was choosing to let this stand. It was the moment that everyone inside the palace understood that the power structure had shifted permanently. Anne, when she finally encountered Camilla 2 days later in a formal palace setting, spoke only 5 words. It is what Diana deserved. Not a plea, not a negotiation, not a suggestion. A statement of fact, a reminder that some wrongs are bigger than personal relationships, that some women matter more than other women's comfort, that some injustices cannot be erased simply because the person responsible for the erasure has grown powerful. Camilla had no response. In the weeks that followed, the consequences became clear. Camilla's schedule of engagements was quietly reduced. Official appearances were declined on her behalf, with vague explanations about her workload or her health. Meanwhile, Diana's old patronages, the ones that had been given away after her death, scattered among various family members, were quietly consolidated. Catherine and William began to reclaim them. The place settings at state dinners shifted. The photographers began pointing their cameras away from Camilla and toward younger, more beloved members of the family. This was not a single act of correction. This was a permanent reordering. The portrait in the Hall of Matriarchs was just the visible symbol of something much deeper, a palace-wide acknowledgement that Diana's memory would no longer be erased, that her legacy would be protected, that the woman who had tried to eliminate her from history had ultimately failed. And William, watching from a distance, saw what he had built finally come into full view. The long game had worked. 27 years earlier, a 15-year-old boy had walked behind his mother's coffin while the entire world watched. His face was composed, his shoulders straight, his grief contained and private in the way that the royal family demanded. He had learned, in that moment, that the institution mattered more than the heart. That protocol mattered more than pain. That duty meant swallowing your truth and moving forward. But that boy never forgot what he had lost. And he never forgave the woman who helped orchestrate the erasure that followed. What happened at Windsor Castle was not a simple act of remembrance. It was not a sentimental gesture or a healing moment. It was an act of institutional power, the reassertion of a truth that Camilla had tried to erase. The portrait hanging in the Hall of Matriarchs was a statement in paint and gilded frame. Diana mattered. Diana deserved to be remembered. Diana's legacy would not be erased. But more than that, it was a statement about power itself. Camilla had spent 30 years believing that she could consolidate enough institutional authority to control the narrative about who mattered and who did not. She had believed that if she positioned herself carefully enough, if she made herself indispensable enough, if she removed the threats to her position carefully enough, she could rewrite history. She could decide which women belonged in the official record, and which women would be forgotten. She was wrong. What she had failed to account for was that there was a boy in that institution, a boy she had underestimated because he was quiet, because he was dutiful, because he was not making headlines, or giving interviews, or challenging her openly. A boy who had learned to move through power structures like a ghost, who had learned that true strength sometimes means waiting, sometimes means building alliances so carefully and quietly that the people you are building against do not even know they are being opposed. William had done something that Harry could not do with all his public rage. He had actually changed the institutional narrative. He had taken a broken promise, a portrait that should have hung in the Hall of Matriarchs from the day Diana died, and he had kept faith with it for 15 years, until he had built enough power to restore it. He had not confronted his father. He had not fought with Camilla. He had not given the palace an excuse to dismiss him as difficult or unstable or bitter about the past. Instead, he had simply waited until he was positioned to execute the correction in a way that was impossible to undo. That is what institutional power actually is. It is not volume. It is not visibility. It is the quiet accumulation of relationships, knowledge, and authority in the places where decisions are actually made. It is knowing the right people. It is understanding the protocols. It is being patient enough to wait for the right moment. And when the moment comes, it is the ability to act in a way that leaves no room for reversal. The portrait remains in the Hall of Matriarchs today. Diana's face looks out from that gallery, her beauty and her dignity preserved forever in the place where she always should have been. Younger visitors who come to Windsor Castle and see her portrait there have no idea that it spent 25 years hidden away. They have no idea that a woman's legacy was nearly erased from history. They simply see a portrait of a beloved princess in the place where she belongs, and they move on, assuming this was always how it was. That is perhaps the most perfect outcome of all. History has been corrected quietly. The injustice has been answered. The person responsible for the erasure has been reminded that she does not control everything, that her power is not absolute, that there are forces within the institution that move in silence and patience, working toward outcomes she cannot prevent. And a young man who walked behind his mother's coffin at 15, swallowing his grief and his rage, finally has his answer. The palace remembers. The institution protects her memory. And the woman who tried to erase her has learned that some legacies cannot be destroyed, no matter how hard you try.